I see this far too often, which is we really need to, which is this kind of, as you say, data dump. And what we really need to do, I mean, consultants, this is our job, but even those who don't have consultants, is to really keep asking your provider, what does this mean? I use this with my team all the time. We call it VDM, which is what does this really mean? Or what does this all mean? And so anytime people give us a bunch of data, including fund managers, we just turn around and say, what does that mean? Because the minute you do that, you ask that question as the next step, and you start getting to some really nub of what your exposures are and what you should be worrying about.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, which showcases inspiring professionals in the world of investment and beyond by focusing on people and their stories. I'm joined today by Anastasia Guha, who is a sustainable investing expert at Redington with over 17 years of experience. She advises on sustainable investment strategy and beliefs, best practices for integrating ESG factors into investment projects, engagement, and ESG reporting and measurement. Welcome, Anastasia. Thanks for joining me today.
Pleasure to be with you, Aoife.
Well, let's start by talking a little bit about your career journey. Can you go back to what you studied at university and whether the twists and turns in there, how it led you to ESG?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it seems like a long time ago now. But at university, I studied economics with a minor in applied statistics. And the reason I studied that was because I wanted to do physics, but I wasn't smart enough to do the kind of maths free-flowing at university level that required. Whereas economics felt like something that was doable. It was quantitative, which I liked, but it also had a real element of how humans behave. And so that's what I did. And after I finished that, I decided to do a master's in the same subjects. And that was because I came from a family where a bachelor's degree was like the absolute basic minimum. My grandmother had a PhD, and there was a sense that, of course, you weren't going to stop studying after a bachelor's, which I know in hindsight sounds pretty weird, but in my family, it was the absolute expectation. And so I did the master's degree, and I was at Warwick. And when I finished that, during that period, I hadn't really thought about going into finance. My father had spent his career in consulting and management consulting. What happened was everyone around me started going through the milk rounds, the investment banks and the buy side. And I just started joining all these processes. And once you're on that sort of milk round cart, you do the assessment centers and you go in for the interviews, then you sort of feel like you're doing something. And that's essentially how I got my first job at Fidelity International. And I really enjoyed it, but I found it very limiting. And it felt like I'd made the wrong choice in terms of career, because it immediately started streaming you as an analyst in the equity world into sectors and doing sector analysis. And I found that I just didn't want to be a sector expert. And I think I was always a bit of a jack of all trades. I wanted to be much more of a generalist and much more curious in that sense. And I bumped into, and you're talking about surprising twists and turns in careers, I bumped into at the Cockpit, which is apparently the oldest pub in the city of London. It's been there since the Middle Ages. I bumped into the editor of Euromoney magazine. And he sort of was talking about how somebody had just resigned and he needed to get someone cheap and fast and quick and, all this kind of stuff. And I sort of plucked up my courage and said to him, can I apply? And long story short, I worked there for a couple of years. I found it utterly fascinating, concentrating on the fixed income market. So I really plugged my knowledge gaps when it came to that. And during that period, again, went to a conference where I was participating in Brussels about EU and EU financial policy. And I bumped into the executive director of the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. He was the founder, real visionary guy called James Gifford. And we got talking. We were on the same flight back from Brussels to London. And he said, there was no train in those days, I should add. So we had to take the flight. And he said to me, young people like you should be in, I was in my late 20s, young people like you should be in sustainable finance. I don't understand why you stick with the mainstream. And I said, oh, what's sustainable finance? And he told me again, a couple of months later, I was working for them. And I did that for 10 years before joining Redington.
And I have to go back before coming back to you, because you would be surprised at how large a role grandmothers play in the stories of many of my guests. What was your grandmother's PhD in?
Economic history.
Oh, my goodness. Quite ahead of her time. And what did she do with that ultimately?
She worked at the UN, actually, her entire career, as did my grandfather. And so that had a real impact on our lives because she was in Russia before the Iron Curtain came down. They were in Algeria, they were in Burundi, they were in New York for 20 years. I was born in New Delhi, and it was not the center of the world by any stretch, but our family motto was always at home in the world. And I think that really fueled our curiosity because suddenly different parts of the world that weren't connected to us were in some way connected to us. And I really feel that's been the sort of guiding principle of my life in many ways.
So inspiring. Well, thank you for sharing that. Well, I confess, littered the word ESG quite liberally throughout your introduction. And on the one hand, we're also hearing that we're at the end of ESG. So maybe can we just give your kind of snapshot of time in terms of where we are with the wording ESG? Do you think it's still appropriate? And what's the kind of level of maybe acceptance of that right now?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, isn't it? I think what's really important when you're looking at any kind of change movement, and certainly even in my 17 odd years of working on this and in the financial markets, is that nothing is constant. And frankly, as a pragmatic person, which I definitely think I am, you use the term that works and the term that's well understood. I think when ESG was coined, in fact, it was coined to some extent by a group of people, including my old boss, James Gifford, was really to try and get the mainstream to integrate non-financial factors, environmental factors, social factors, and governance factors into valuations, into DCF models. That was the point of that particular coinage. And then, of course, it took on a life of its own, much as things that are popular do. They go into the ether and become something different from what it was intended. I personally, as you know, use sustainable investing, and part of it is because it could mean a bunch of things. It's very difficult to be against sustainability in general, because often we're talking about fiscal balance sheets being sustainable, etc., not necessarily about the environment. And the question around whether ESG as a term is relevant is only when the idea of integrating these factors into valuations become a political issue. Then, frankly, whatever nomenclature you use is probably irrelevant because none of it is based on logic. So the backlash is not necessarily based on logic because we know where we're headed in terms of resource depletion in this world. And we know that the markets move with resources. And so unless we can find some way to make infinite a set of finite resources, this will always be a factor in the way we think about companies and issuers. And so the backlash, if it was logical, and I think in the early days that I worked in this space, it was a logical backlash. It was because there was not enough data, or there was not enough education, or there wasn't enough proof that these impacts would have a negative or a downside in the life of the investment holding. Today, all of those things have been reversed. So that's something to consider.
We will return certainly to this topic around the terminology and whether we've moved on from there and how we would best, I suppose, achieve these goals by maybe getting away from the weaponization of the term. But I'd love to cycle through a few topics because I think they will bring out the essence of the backlash and how we can get around it. Maybe the first would be data. Where do you think we are in terms of the credibility, integrity of sustainability data and its use?
Nuanced response here. Because I think that on certain factors, the data is exponentially improved. Anything to do with emissions, particularly on direct emissions of the company, which is the scope 1, scope 2, the data is pretty good. And often the way to think about this is, are you getting different numbers from different providers? And the answer often is no in scope 1, scope 2. Where we've always had a more of an issue is scope 3, which is the use of the product or the supply chain emissions, which is in many ways the most important bit, but there are issues there. The important thing with all climate data is that change is coming. Change is coming because these will be put into audits before long. As you know, the IFRS Foundation, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, is coming up with how this is going to work. And then various accounting jurisdictions around the world are beginning to endorse these, which means that these will be audited into annual reports. So I think we can see the endpoint in the medium term within the next 3 years of climate data essentially becoming very, very good. Where we see more nascency is everything else. Now, governance, on the other hand, has always been good. So that's another very good part of sustainable investing from a data perspective. Where there is issues is around social factors, and that's mostly because there's no real definition and there's no audited or required reporting around it that is global. And of course, now the new topic often is nature and biodiversity, and those are also new things.
So not necessarily something that requires throwing the baby out with the bathwater simply because it's not maybe as comparable as a set of credit ratings.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And actually, I would be hard pressed to find an issue today where if you really wanted to, you wouldn't get a specialist provider to do some pretty good data for you, as good as you would expect in a lot of other subjective data points that are financially focused.
One point on data, though, I think we've discussed previously is data dumps. And I suppose clients and receiving vast reports that perhaps are overladen with data, not particularly telling a story and quite expensive to produce and used as to tick a box, which would not necessarily really to indicate progress. Do you think that sometimes we're swimming and overwhelmed with data and that may be a problem in itself?
I know what you think about this, Ethan. And I totally agree with you, because I'll give you an example. We recently worked with a client, a large scheme, who was getting data from a large credit rating agency. And the data came as a PDF, and there was no backing Excel spreadsheet. So there was no backing underlying data. There was just responses to various questions that they used the data in a PDF format to provide. And this was tabled at their investment committee. And of course, no one knew what to say about it. It just felt like 68 pages of something that was relevant, but no one could exactly tell you what was relevant. And I see this far too often, which is we really need to, which is this kind of, as you say, data dump. And what we really need to do, I mean, consultants, this is our job, but even those who don't have consultants, is to really keep asking your provider, what does this mean? I use this with my team all the time. We call it VDM, which is what does this really mean? Or what does this all mean? And so anytime people give us a bunch of data, including fund managers, we just turn around and say, what does that mean? Because the minute you do that, you ask that question as the next step, and you start getting to some really nub of what your exposures are and what you should be worrying about.
I love that. I will start applying that filter. What does this mean? But I've always actually, to Redington's credit, that always comes through in your materials. There is a kind of a so what, the way I would reframe that for my young clients. And I think that's right. The other area where we are also swimming a little bit in data is on engagement reporting. It seems that engagement has taken the upper hand versus divestment when it comes to approach to some controversial matters. And again, engagement reporting can often be voluminous. And again, not necessarily indicate any impact made through engagement or effective engagement, essentially. What's your read on the current state of engagement? Has it gone too far, and has it really delivered?
So there's two things. One is, what is the thing itself doing, engagement or stewardship? And the other is, what's the data? And I can start with the data by saying, actually, the data is really problematic. Notice the ones who are very confident about outcomes and who feel like they've really got something there in terms of achievements over their program, love to talk about it. Everyone else loves to obfuscate. And so when you start to see a lot of words which are not telling you anything, you know that it's probably because they don't have something to tell you. And I really think we should start finding quantity a bit suspicious on anything. Quantity of climate data, quantity of engagement data, it's starting to sort of not pass the sniff test. One thing that we did at Redington is, and have done really almost for the last 10 years, but have been making public for the last 4, is a sustainability survey. So what that is we go to our managers with whom our clients run money and our preferred managers and a few other large players outside of those 2 buckets. And we ask them questions around, quite comparable questions year on year, around what they're up to in the sustainable investment area. And one of the things that we have found on stewardship is that when you ask them, are, the themes that often come up with clients, so climate change, human rights, nature, corporate governance issues, workforce disclosure issues, those topics, we ask them, are they relevant to the strategy that they're running? And it's really interesting. Things like, for instance, climate, I remember this number off the top of my head, it's like 92% say yes, it's relevant to the strategy I'm running. And then we ask them, in the strategy that you're running, what kind of substantive and proactive engagements have you done? Now, because we're in the UK Stewardship Code actually gives you definitions of what substantive and proactive mean. And then we sort of say, what's the match between the two? And actually, if this was a bar chart, the blue bar, which is, yes, it's relevant, and then the pink bar, which is, and we do something about it, really quite far apart. And so those are the ways that you now have to start talking to fund managers. And that is more relevant than the reams and reams of number of letters they've written and the number of engagements they've had or the number of touch points they've had with companies less relevant.
I love that slightly contrarian approach to volume. I applaud that message. And I suppose just segueing to two other areas where we're seeing quite a lot of volume and again, not a great deal of understanding. One will be net zero commitments and how to achieve them and get there. I'd love to hear your comment on that, and maybe tied to that, because it is seen as the route to that. You mentioned already the explosion in nature-based solutions that we're seeing.
Yeah, so I think to go to net zero, net zero, if we think about what that was, Paris enshrined within it the need to stay below 2 degrees. And they said well below in the very last minute revisions of the text. Now, well below 2 degrees could be 1.7 degrees. It's not necessarily 1.5 degrees. What happened was 2 years later, when the net zero or the 1.5 degrees came out, there was a sense that let's try for this goal because this is where we can really keep the world intact. Now, even today, we're at 1.3 degrees, if you look just at surface temperature increase. And we're not keeping the world intact because we didn't take into account, because we didn't know the kinds of tipping points we would start to see. So we speak together this autumn of 2024. I've just come back from Spain where 200 people lost their lives to a flood in Valencia. We're not in the developing world, we're in Valencia, Spain. So the idea that 1.5 was somehow going to keep the world preserved is probably incorrect. And the idea that anything above 1.5 is going to somehow plunge us into the depths of a sort of hell-like heat is also probably incorrect. The scientists are coalescing around the fact that there's no cliff edge, but of course, every degree that we can limit is probably meaning that we preserve a little bit more of the planet in the way that we've always known it. So net zero commitments, they were, if you think about when they really sort of kicked off, it was just before Glasgow in the UK, the Glasgow COP in the UK. People really went for it without really thinking through what this means from an investment strategy perspective in a world which is not headed to net zero. So we all as investors care about tracking error, or many of us do. And essentially your portfolio, if it was to be head to net zero at the moment, would have quite a large and ever growing tracking error with the global economy. So what do you do about that? The goal itself is aspirational, and I think we should have it, because without it, we'd get nowhere at all. But I also think that we have to understand, to get anywhere near it, we have to make some changes to the way we invest, or this is literally greenwashing.
Well, and that's a perfect segue to the greenwashing point, because again, we've seen a massive volume of ESG funds, so labeled, come out. We've seen cresting of demand for that. We've seen some of that fall away, and some of the funds maybe rebrand or fall away. Do you think that some of the greenwashing pushback has been merited? And was this a necessary kind of maturing phase to sort of separate wheat from chaff to get to a more stable body of sustainable focused products?
It's so interesting. When I saw this sort of massive hype, and as not just hype, but real inflows into green funds in 2020 and 2021, where they did phenomenally well, I really thought, oh, this is going to be trouble. And partly, I think it's because people don't realize that what they're doing is thematic investing when you're doing that. Take the green out, it's just thematic investing. And the thing with thematic investing is that it's really risky and you're taking a big bet. And if you're okay with that, then great. But think about what size bet that is and how you're getting paid for it, etc. And of course, the minute that the world started to reopen, and of course, we had the war in Ukraine, that completely changed that bet, and you were caught on the wrong side of it. It doesn't really change the sort of broader macro themes around sustainable investment. It just means the things you would never do or do in a very different way, like thematic investing, need to be taken in the same way as you would any thematic investment. So the idea that there are massive inflows and massive outflows, I wouldn't really take that very seriously. The one thing I would say is you're absolutely right. There has been a growing up of what this agenda is, what it means, what it can and cannot achieve. And part of it is understanding that to be able to get to the numbers that people want from a net zero perspective or other sort of climate goals, we will have to have the right policy environment. So the industry is not going to fix this, or finance is not going to fix this on their own. The other thing that has, made me think, going back to my grandmother who studied the history of economic thought, I kind of think of what happened, and you and I have discussed this before, Ethan, what happened with the dot-com bubble. From the dot-com bubble, we got the Magnificent Seven, who are running the markets and ruling the roost and have been for a while. So the question isn't that this is a pushback of the agenda, it's a pushback of doing it badly. And it has taught everyone, least of all those who are doing strategic asset allocation, a bit of a lesson.
And just speaking of that pushback, and I think, it's been well argued as to whether there was some overreaching by the sustainable investment lobby, too much claims of causation. And this kind of gets us to some of the social and governance changes, whether it be diversity on boards, et cetera, relating to better performance. Some of these causal links are not provable. Therefore, maybe they get bandied about in a lazy fashion. And that then gives gaps and flaws that enable a counter argument to be developed. Where would you say we are in the level of pushback? And how do you suggest that the sustainable finance industry, I suppose, counters that?
Yeah, what an interesting question. I think that when it comes to observable phenomena, so here I'm talking really about environmental factors, where there's a lot of degradation and resource depletion, I think it's a lot easier there. When you come to governance factors and social factors, things seem harder. And part of the reason is the question I get asked, sort of obviously behind closed doors, and you'll see in a second why, is, okay, so how do I make money out of this? So we want to fix some early years education, for instance, in the UK through a UK VC. How do I make money out of this? And frankly, the problem is where you can make money out of it and where there is the ability to at least have proof of concept through small VC or growth PE type of investment, and then you scale. That's fine. Capitalism works. We can do that. But where that is not the case, where actually there's no green demand and there's no ability to pay more than the cheapest possible rate for X or Y consumer product, then things start falling apart because the financial incentives for a firm to get into that is just not there. So, I think in terms of the pushback, what we want to do, and I say this to my clients all the time, let's use the environment to bring up social. So what I mean by that is where we are making positive contributions in terms of allocations on the environmental side of things, whether it's nature, whether it's climate or emissions, let's make sure that those managers are thinking heavily about pushing the companies that they own or they lend to on social factors. So bring up the social floor. So let's make sure contracts look good. Let's make sure everyone's getting paid fairly. Let's make sure women are treated as well as they possibly can be. Workforce or human capital is managed well. Let's make sure the governance of those companies is what we would like to see as owners or lenders to those companies. And I think that resonates better. And I'll give you an example. We had a client this week. I was making an investment into a forestry manager. And what they said was where we can really add value is to show them what sort of contracts work well for farm labor when it comes to seasonal workers who are often, get the real raw end of the stick when it comes to pay and benefits. And you can imagine that the fund manager, that's a real partnership between the fund manager and the asset owner, because the asset owner provides them with a very sort of concrete contract that they use themselves or one of their constituents use. And they can see how much they can get the fund manager, which is a large globally operating fund, to start to incorporate some of that in. So we can see how there could be ways that this could work.
I love that. It's hard to argue, certainly, with the social point. It seems a universally non-divisive, non-partisan issue. So although occasionally, of course, workers' rights may be partisan, but it does certainly seem like a good place to start. And it's a good link to my question around, I suppose, social and governance in our own industry in finance, because this is a topic that comes up often on this podcast around diversity of the industry and whether it's improving and whether it reflects society. How do you think about diversity and inclusion within finance right now?
So at Redington, because of our heritage of our founders being incredibly passionate about this. We think this is something that we learn in the ether in terms of culture carriers. Everyone thinks about this a lot. We think about not just the gender diversity, but in terms of socioeconomic and as a result, therefore, often ethnic backgrounds. Are we getting a real representation of the community in which we operate and that we're part of? And honestly, I think that whilst the diversity is relatively good in some years, it can be very variable. We could have cohorts of graduate trainees who are largely women, and other years we could have absolutely none. So I think that the intentionality is very hugely there, particularly at Redington. But sometimes clearly the supply is not always uniform. That's one thing. The second thing is this is talked about ad nauseum, isn't it, Ethan? But there's also the issue of seniority, and can you start to model the right kind of behaviors later in life when you are at a stage where you can actually bring others up the curve with you? And I certainly feel quite, and this is where I'm going to get a little bit personal about this, but I am an Indian-born woman with young children. And so in many ways, I feel very much on the other end of that diversity spectrum. But I also come from a very similar socioeconomic background as what is expected in the city from an educational perspective, from a socioeconomic background perspective. So I'm very, very cognizant of that. Some people have said to me, the only people who can make it to MD who look like you, people who have your privileges. And I don't know if, clearly that the answer should be no, but is it? Is it something that we have to take into account? I mean, if we look at the senior people in finance who are women or people of color or people who were born in the global south, do we see a very similar socioeconomic background? And a last thought I would leave you with is when I worked for the UNPRI, one of the things that somebody once said to me in a very throwaway remark, and I was quite taken aback by it, is notice that everyone who works in this organization, this was like 250 odd people from 60 countries. It was an incredibly diverse organization from ethnic origin, cultural, language, and gender. But we were all very similar socioeconomically. And the way that was deciphered was pretty much everyone's parents had degrees and some had, higher degrees. And that was a real shock to me. And, we then went back to our recruitment system and started to look at how, in a non-discriminatory way, can we make sure that we're not just picking people who are successful in various parts of the world to join us and then looking very diverse, but not actually being diverse in reality, and certainly not in terms of cognitive diversity.
And of course, that's something one of Redington's founders, Dawit Konaté-Ahulu, is passionate about. I know the socioeconomic mobility and great to, I think, look at it across many fronts. Well, I'd love to just end with some closing questions, some reflections. It's been a great, rich discussion, cycling through a number of topics relating to sustainable finance so far. You mentioned a number of inspiring family members in your own personal history. Professionally or otherwise, were there any mentors or key people who, I think you've mentioned a few already, who maybe set you on the path or influenced how you see the professional world?
I always find this question a bit embarrassing because, frankly, I'm not given to the mentor thing. But here's the thing. I'm deeply driven by curiosity. What I found amazing is people who are equally curious, no matter how successful they are. I find that very inspiring, and I find it very common amongst leaders and winners in whatever markets you're looking at. And as you know, one of the advantages of working in the financial markets is that you actually look at the whole economy and speak to people in different sectors. And I find the more senior they are, they're still reading everything they can get their hands on. They're reading widely, they're reading fiction, they're talking to people. Every time I see someone senior who's really inspirational, they will ask me a bunch of questions about my life, about my work, rather than talking about themselves. And it's because they're these big sponges, like trying to learn everything they can. And I find that truly inspirational. That's one thing that I saw amongst the leaders that I worked with, whether it was Mark Johnson at Euromoney or James Gifford at UNPRI. But the other thing I find is clarity of purpose. I think when mentors or leaders have clarity of purpose, you kind of realize, wow, the ability to focus on what it is that will make a difference for this particular thing that I'm trying to achieve And to see that in action at the most senior levels is very inspirational to me.
I love that emphasis on clarity of purpose, because it's something they don't teach you in business school. You have to only, I think, discover the hard way from many experiences of lack of such clarity. And this gets me to the last question around words of wisdom, in addition to what you've already shared, maybe, or something you maybe wish you had known when you were younger, or anything to leave us with.
Yeah, I was a painfully shy young person, and I wish I had the ability to realize that my self-consciousness was only noticed by me. So had I known that, or had I really understood that between the ages of maybe 11 or 12 and 25, I think I would have had a much easier time of it.
Well, thank you for that frank admission. I think it is a reflection of really how much self-interest is in the world, that people rarely are as focused on others' faults as it may seem. And thank you also for the clarity you brought to this discussion. I think a healthy challenge to some of the norms between the voluminous reporting of data to some of the directions of travel, and importantly, some concrete suggestions as to how we can continue to ensure this is a viable part of sustainable finance. And thank you for giving us concrete case studies and examples of that, and for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you for having me, Aoife. It was a pleasure talking to you.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear from more inspiring investment professionals, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.